Well, hello there and welcome. My name is Stephanie Safarian, and you're listening to episode 500. Oh my gosh, we made it. 500 episodes of the Sustainable Minimalist Podcast. This is a listener-supported show about intentional and eco-friendly minimalist living. So many of us feel like we're lacking in real life these days. We're lacking in emotional, physical connections. We're missing the support of our villages. And that's why on today's show, we're doing some big things. We are first combating the social atrophy that so many of us are experiencing. We are also rebuilding our villages in this post-COVID world. Today, I'm speaking with Rosie Spinks. She is a former journalist. She is also the brains behind the What Do We Do Now That We're Here publication on Substack. Now, I do not want to keep taking up our precious time together by asking you to subscribe and support this show, but I have to do it because this show is not financially stable. Ad revenue, which historically is the way that this show made money, it's no longer a stable source of revenue in 2024 for independent podcasters like myself. So if after you listen to Rosie and I today, if after listening to our conversation, you find this show inspirational, if it impacted your life or impacted your future behaviors in some way, shape, or form, please consider supporting this work with $5 a month or $45 a year. The link to do that is in the show notes. I'm continuing to publish episodes like this one for everybody because, and again, I'm biased, but I do believe this is important work, and the message, especially this show that's getting out into the world, is an important message that everybody should hear. I too hate that dreaded paywall. And so if this episode hits your heart, please consider supporting it financially so that those who can't support it financially can continue to access this content. Thank you so much. Now on to our conversation. Rosie, I am absolutely thrilled to have you on the show. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to talk about this topic.
Yeah, we're talking about villages today. It takes a village, and yet amidst the loneliness epidemic that so many of us are experiencing, our villages are gone. There's no villages. We're one man and women shows. So before we talk about rebuilding our villages, let's talk about you. Who are you? What do you do? Tell us.
Sure. So I am a writer and a mother. And until COVID, I was a very ambitious and career-oriented journalist. That was all I ever wanted to do with my life. And I'd been doing it since university and had achieved many of the things I wanted to achieve. And then for me, COVID was, like it was for many people, like a hard stop on my old life. And the pause really forced me to reckon with what I was pursuing and what it was doing to me, being in the news cycle, working all the time. So I changed a lot of things about my life. And the reason I'm telling you that is because a lot of those changes led to this topic we're going to talk about today.
You mentioned the pandemic, so I'm going to latch on to that. When we think about the loneliness epidemic that has followed the pandemic, we tend to blame the pandemic for this epidemic. But I find myself wondering whether 21st century life was setting the stage for the loneliness epidemic long before the pandemic ever arrived on our doorsteps. I'm thinking about our transition to technological living, always on a device. And so I'm just curious for your thoughts here. You know, our proverbial villages, they have been decimated. What decimated them, in your opinion, and what are the consequences of living without a village?
I think that COVID was like an accelerant, and also it shined a spotlight on it. As you alluded to, it sort of hastened this move towards a totally screen-based existence. We ordered everything. We had our social lives on screens. We talked to everyone on there. We worked that way. Of course, I'm saying we, and not everyone had that experience, but a lot of people did. And to some extent, it felt like, oh, wow, look at how much progress the world has made that we can live this way. Like there was a little bit of novelty to it. I remember like meeting my book club for hours and hours on Friday nights and like drinking way too much wine. And it genuinely did feel nourishing at the time. But then the farther we got into it, and in the UK, we had much longer lockdowns and stricter than in the US. I remember reading, and I'll never forget reading it, that there's like a bundle of nerves, like receptors in between your shoulder blades, which are primed to release good chemicals. And if you're a scientist, please forgive me for how I'm explaining this, when they're touched, because of course, that's an area of your body that you don't touch yourself. So usually someone's touching you there if they're giving you a hug or slapping you on the back. And it made me realize, like, when I read that, I just all at once realized the limitations of the kind of progress or the so-called progress that we were all living under. Yeah, I really think then coming out of COVID, a lot of people have struggled to kick those habits. So in that sense, I think it has hastened this problem or accelerated this problem. And then to your bigger question of what happened to the village, it's a very big question. But if I could answer it in a sentence, I think the sort of social and economic models that we live and exist and work under have incentivized us to believe that we don't need other people. And the reason they've done that is because that's quite good for these models, right? Like if we all retreat into our homes with our nuclear families or into our apartments if we're not in a nuclear family, and we order everything we need and we summon everything with a smartphone and we text our therapist and we use Zoom when we need social interaction. These are all things that are good for shareholder value, right? Whereas like the flip side of that is if you can borrow you need a tool and you know your neighbor well and you can go ask them for it and borrow it, that's the opposite of that. And that's just one small example. So the kind of meta story here is that the way we are pushed to move is towards this atomized existence. And that's really like those are really economic forces that push us to do that, right? Make us more productive so we can work more and earn more money. But when we do that, we lose this thing, which I've come to believe through writing about this is really a foundational part or the foundational part of who we are. We literally cannot exist without each other.
So much you said there, Rosie, I want to capitalize on. You mentioned Zoom was a lifeline for us during the pandemic. I remember having Zoom Christmas Eve with my family, my extended family, my mother, my sister. I remember thinking at the time, thank goodness for technology. Ugh. How horrible would this Christmas Eve be if I couldn't at least see and talk to my loved ones? But now the pandemic's over and our Zoom-like existence has stuck around. And I think what you're speaking to there is the fact that communal care, caring for our neighbors, caring for other human beings, lives outside the realm of capitalism, right? When we care for somebody else, there's no money exchanged. And perhaps communal care is a threat to our economic engines in some way. And that's why the tides are pushing us ever increasingly towards technology. And so I found your Substack. Oh my gosh, I absolutely loved it. You wrote a 2-part piece, I believe, on rebuilding our villages. And that's what we're discussing today. You write that we don't need friends. We need people. What do you mean by this?
Yeah, so this, I can't entirely take credit for this. This comes from actually a commencement speech from the writer Kurt Vonnegut. He has a book collection of his speeches called If This Isn't Nice, What Is? If you want to check it out. He basically says that the reason why most marriages fail is because there aren't enough people in them. And he doesn't mean in the polyamorous sense. He means neighbors, friends, the weird guy down the street, strange uncles, over-involved aunties, the types of people that if we weren't living in these kind of location displaced ways, which we can talk a little more about, would just naturally be in our lives. And so we're relying on our partners, whether we're married or not, for all of it, for support, for domestic chores, for humor, for romantic stuff, for friendship. And it's too much for two people to bear, basically. I really felt that when I had my son, and he's 2 now. And often the conversation is about how like men don't do enough in the domestic sphere. And look, that's true. The bar is pretty low for guys, let's be honest. But my partner is an excellent, totally involved co-parent, and many of the sort of archetypes you hear of dads that kind of quote unquote babysit their kids, he's not like that. And yet I still have found that I'm doing too much. And I feel like it just shouldn't be this way. It was never meant to be shared by 2 people. And so the idea that you need people, not friends, was a paradigm shift for me. And it's been a pretty recent one. I started writing about where all my friendships had gone, and sort of have realized that's actually not what I'm actually talking about. Isn't friendships in the kind of classical sense, but people and networks and care and things as simple as when you have a kid, especially if they're not in full-time childcare or childcare at all, the days are long. You don't need someone to hang out with who has all your interests, shares the same political views, who listens to the same podcast. You just need someone whose kid is also 2 and also full of energy on a Wednesday afternoon, who will just go to the park with you on a moment's notice so you don't have to plan it 3 weeks in advance. That's people, proximity, frequency, reciprocity, like expanding your idea of the people you make an effort with and spend time with beyond the kind of classical idea of friendship, I think is really healthy. And Kurt Vonnegut in this speech says we should be joining civic, local, community organizations, even if they're like weird and cringe and not totally your vibe, even if they're deeply uncool. That's what we need. Like we literally need more. He says we need 50 people in our lives on a regular, sort of low effort, recurring basis.
Wow. 50. I'm counting. I can count on one hand the amount of people in my life at the moment.
It doesn't have to be people you really like. I think that's the difference. And that sounds weird, but it doesn't have to be people. Yeah, I'll give you an example. I have an allotment, which in the UK are little parcels of land that are owned by local councils, and they've been around since the war, and you can put your name on a wait list and be allocated a little patch to grow vegetables on. It was like the kind of Victory Gardens idea from the war that people still do. So I recently got one, and I have 2 allotment neighbors on either side of me who are both men in their 70s who are retired and are like extremely eager to give me all sorts of gardening advice, sometimes unsolicited. But those are people, right? I see them week to week. And though I would never have anything in common with these people, I might even actively disagree with their politics. That doesn't matter. That's the point. Seeing people in your day, in your week, that you don't have to send 10 emails to schedule it with.
I really appreciate that tip, because the term friends comes with a really high bar, right? We tend to think that a friend needs to have the same views, goals, kids the same age, availability, all the things. But we don't need friends. We just need more people. I'm the type of person that, like, if I'm going to make friends, like, you're going to be my soul sister. We're going to be really tight. But it doesn't have to be so serious, so deep. And I'm thinking too, if I had, like Kurt Vonnegut says, 50 people, each one of those 50 people would take a little bit of pressure off of my closest relationships to be all the things for me. Like my husband would no longer then have to encompass all the things that 50 people individually could give me.
Yeah. Another way to put it, I often think about this is like, a lot of mothers a lot of moms I know will just lament like the idea that 3 times a day you have to think of things to feed your kids and your family. And it's like this unbelievably huge mental task of like, making sure you have the right things in, making sure you're eating a varied diet. Like it just never ends. And in a environment where it's hard to find the right language for it, because I don't want to say pre-modern or like when we lived in tribes, because a lot of places are still like this in a more natural way. But if we lived with a village, let's just say it like that, it would be built into your week that there would just be points where the meals were taken care of, right? You would be invited to maybe the grandparents' house on Sundays, or if you guys were sick, maybe the neighbor down the street brings over some soup. or you have a recurring thing with a friend where you get your kids together and trade off bringing lunches or snacks. It would just happen, right? That burden wouldn't be quite as heavy. And it goes back to what we were saying about capitalism. The idea that like, think of a suburban street, like every single night on that street, every single family is cooking dinner for themselves. In a historical sense, that's bonkers. Just wouldn't have been that way. And that, as you alluded to, that takes a little bit, not a lot, but a little bit of that pressure off. And that, I think, really adds up.
Well, also in your Substack, you suggest that we change the way we talk with others. We enact some communication shifts in the way we converse when we do see people. Can you give me a couple of them?
So when it comes to communication shifts, I think, and this is like a big one that I have been very guilty of not doing in the past, is this actually came from one of my readers because I crowdsourced some of these tips. Be the person who asks twice. So I love this advice because it's so elegant and simple. But I think a lot of us feel like this is another admin task and we already have so much to do and we're so burned out from trying to keep afloat and survive. And then you have to add sending all these WhatsApps or messages or emails to try to get people together. And so we cross the divide and ask, oh, do you want to do this? Or we should get the kids together sometime. And they're like, yeah, totally. And then nothing happens. And then you never do it because you're sort of like, well, I tried. Like I did my part and they didn't. But being the person who asks twice, I think is about recognizing that we are living in a time where this stuff has become hard because for all the reasons we're talking about, there's a phrase that the therapist and sort of celebrity therapist Esther Perel uses where she calls like the post-COVID era has this, she calls it a social atrophy to it. People have forgotten how to just naturally be social relational creatures. And so when you shift your mindset to be like, okay, people are bad at this, including me. This is not coming naturally to us. You then being the person who asks twice is like, you're kind of working against the grain and that's okay. It's not that people don't like you. It's not that woe is me. It's always me making the effort. Is that you as a person think this is important and valuable. So you're going to put a little extra effort into it. And the reader who gave this tip also said, being proactive when introducing myself, sharing contact info, making time to say yes to other people's invitations and trying to say yes the first time I'm asked. Most people don't ask twice. So again, be the person who does.
I had a guest on the show recently who highlighted, at least here in the United States, we're founded on this rugged individualist ideal. We want to do everything by ourselves. To ask for help would be a sign of weakness. Supposedly it's not, but I don't know. It's not a sign of weakness to ask for help, but most of us don't do it. And so my guest, Jared Anderson, listeners, if you remember, but he used the example of if a neighbor asked us to shovel their driveway after a snowstorm, we would absolutely do it. We'd be happy to be asked. But would we be the person to ask our neighbor to shovel our own driveway? Going out of our way to ask for help is just not something that we are in the practice of doing these days. And so when we talk about extending our village, that means asking for help when we need it, but also extending our offer to help by asking twice, right? Because the first time, at least here in the US, the answer is probably going to be no, even if the answer is yes, I do need help.
Right. Yeah. And I also think it's actually, I think most people listening to this, and I go so far as to say most people, probably wouldn't find it hard to make the offer, to make the invitation. I think most people actually find it harder to admit they need help, to admit that they actually aren't holding up well, or actually they do not have enough childcare and it would be great if someone came and took their kids for a couple hours, or they are feeling lonely and do want someone to just come have a walk with them every Sunday, whatever it is. It is really hard to admit those things. And part of the reason for that is because everything we said at the top of this conversation, like we have been led to believe that we can satisfy all of our needs through the great advances of modern capitalism. Like It's a little bit like, what do you mean you are lonely? Don't you have all the apps on your phone that can connect you to every single person all over the world? But what I have found is that as great as my many far-flung friends literally all over the world are, it's not enough. I need people IRL, physically in my life. I need people who see me. And the way you, I think, get that vulnerability, the way that becomes a little bit easier, and one of the things the piece explored is you kind of have to see people in low stakes moments. You have to say yes to the game night invitation. You have to say yes to the impromptu hang or whatever it is, so that when you are having a really tough week or everything has fallen apart, it's a little bit easier. You're not just popping out of nowhere with no context to say, hey, can you take my kid for the afternoon or whatever it is. But yeah, showing vulnerability and the fact that you cannot do it all yourself is hard, which is crazy because it's just not how we're designed to live. At a sort of cellular neurological level, there's so many ways you could make the argument that we are designed to thrive in relationship with each other and in physical place-based relationship.
And to that point, I've just recently came across some interesting research, and listeners, I will link to it in the show notes for anybody interested, but it doesn't even have to go that deep. It just has to be about seeing and being physically around other people. Smiling at a stranger is a profound way to brighten not just the stranger's day, but your day as well. So yeah, it doesn't have to be deep. We don't have to be making soul sister friendships, but we do have to get out of our house and off our screens and be in proximity to other people.
And to just flesh this out a little more, when I was in my 20s, I lived in London. As I said, I was very ambitious. I knew loads of creative, interesting people. I still do know those people. And I sort of developed this belief that I could live anywhere in the world. I could move me to Hong Kong tomorrow. It wouldn't matter. I could make it happen, meet new friends. I could find work as a freelancer through all the amazing creative contacts and people I knew. And in some way, all those people I kept in rotation because they were useful to me, useful to my career. They had something to offer me. And I know that sounds quite manipulative and transactional. I didn't think of it that way. They genuinely are all amazing people that I would love to be around. But it didn't have the context of place, really. There was this uprootedness to it that led me to believe that I didn't really need anyone or anything other than my ingenuity and, my laptop. And COVID then followed by leaving London and having a kid. Just to say that belief system came crashing down would be an understatement. And it was hard. It was a real identity shift for me to be oh my God, I cannot do this alone. It's actually embarrassing that I ever thought that a human life could be sustained in that way. Because I think certainly having a kid is not the only way to realize this, but it's a pretty harsh teacher. If you have been operating with the kind of life that I was, you have a long fall down to earth or reality, if that makes sense.
Yes. As someone with 2 children,
yeah.
I understand what you're saying on a bone deep level for sure. I want to go back to just the proximity to other people suggestion. You suggest in your piece that we enact place-based rituals. And when I read this, I thought to myself, yes, this is what I need. Explain it to us.
Yeah, so a place-based ritual is really just doing the same thing at around the same time every week. And I think that would look quite different depending on the culture that you or the country that you live in and what your lifestyle and your obligations are. And it's doing that even when maybe you don't feel like it. You don't want to go to that Saturday morning yoga or Pilates class. You'd rather just stay home. Or the thing that's really been working for me recently is I go to this Wednesday morning toddler group. And it's not cool or hip in any way. It's like in a church hall and there's all these like old church ladies who try and get you to go to to the church. But I see the same moms and their kids there every week, and I don't have to plan it. No one has to send text messages about it. A lot of the moms there live really close by, as do I. So it's become this ritual of going, and it's fomented more people and hopefully will lead to friendships, like that kind of deeper thing. And I don't feel like going every week. Sometimes it would be easier to just not go. But the act of showing up, I think I say in the piece, sticking to a routine in this way seems boring and predictable, but it opens up the opportunity for more spontaneity and spontaneous connections. Because if people know that they're going to see you at that coffee shop every Sunday, or here in the UK, having a local pub is like a thing that people do. So they see you in the pub every Saturday night, or they see you at the toddler group. They're more likely to say, "Hey, how's it going?" when they see you walking your dog, or to introduce themselves. Whereas if you go every once in a while, or you're not a sure bet in a way, like the stakes are higher reaching out if like you're going to turn around and say, "What? I don't really come here that often, actually." So I have found that sticking to a few rituals, even if it's just, I'm sure a really common one for people is going to the same coffee shop where the baristas know you and they know your order and maybe you see the same people. Like having a few things like that and realizing that those are important beyond the service or product or thing you're getting out of them. Yeah, you could order it online or have a glass of wine at home instead of going to the pub. But there's something emergent about those interactions when they're done on a regular basis that's really important.
Yeah, you write in your piece that quantity time leads to quality time. And that's so true. Pre-pandemic, every Tuesday morning, my baby and I would go to a bar class. And the place I went, there was childcare for my baby. I would do a little bit of exercise. I was not there to build my village or make friends. I was there to, first of all, get up, get dressed, get out of the house. But being around the same group of women every single Tuesday morning, spending quantity time there over the course of years led to quality time. I made friends just by consistently showing up. And so I love that idea, but that brings me to my next question, which is, what do you say to people who are exhausted and can't muster up the energy to even put themselves out there, get out the door? I don't know. Take that away.
First of all, I've been there, and especially if you have young children, like solidarity, like we know how you feel. But okay, so a good way to frame it, I think, is asking, what is this giving back to me? So a lot of the things we do in our lives are an energy drain, right? Like they take from us, whether it's money, time, energy, etc. There are things that we do that should give us energy back. And I think part of the problem with this whole technological based lifestyle is it doesn't really give you that much back. Work gives you money, which is some kind of compensation, but that sort of only goes so far once your needs are met. So don't do things that drain you further, but you have to cross what's the phrase I'm looking for? You have to get past the first couple steps of like, essentially dragging your ass out the door. Because once you're there and once you're in proximity to other people and once I'm going to use the toddler group again, but like once the kids are like running feral around the church hall and you no longer have to like really be involved in what they're doing and you can just sit down and have a low stakes chat with someone and have a cup of tea, like then you're like, oh, this actually feels good. Like this is easier than sitting in my house, even though I had to drag us out the door. So seek out things that feel good once you've done them, and then get into that. You have to kind of rebuild that neural pathway in your brain to know that these practices are not just about another thing on your to-do list, but are about giving some energy and life force back to you. I mean, I'm sure we could find some collection of studies for a scientific basis to say that's true, but I'm of the belief that we don't really need peer-reviewed science to tell us that we feel good after we spend time in community with other people, though I'm sure that science exists.
I'm sure it exists as well. Yeah, Rosie, something you don't know about me is that I love a good exercise metaphor, and getting ourselves out the door to socialize or to be around other people works great with a good exercise metaphor. Like, ask yourself, how are you going to feel once you've done it? I mean, does anybody want to get up and like exercise? I don't know. But the way I get myself to exercise is by telling myself, I'm going to feel so much better once I do it. So same with getting out the door, I think. Whenever I socialize as an extrovert, it's hard for me to get out the door. But once I do it, I always think to myself, oh, I'm so glad. I'm so glad I did that. It brings me life.
Right. And it's not, look, I know some people maybe tend more towards introversion. Actually, I think I do, which I didn't realize until COVID. So it's not like you need to be going to cocktail parties and like being a social butterfly. It can be more gentle, low stakes stuff. Even if you challenge yourself once a week to go for a walk with someone. One of the tips in the piece was also like, when you're making plans with people, it's hard to make plans with people. And that's one of the drains of this is the constant messages and the calendars and the canceling and the 7 weeks in advance and all of that. That's actually not really how this should feel too much. So the tip was give people time horizons. Be like, every Sunday morning, I go to this cafe and then I go for a walk around this park, or then I go to this class or this whatever. If you ever are free on a Saturday, let me know. Let's go together. Or I always have my kid on Wednesday afternoons and we have nothing to do. So if you ever find yourself at a loose end and want to come over or want to go to the park, text me by 12 o'clock and we probably can go. So giving people a kind of sense of when you're free, and then also sometimes extending the invitation, like it makes it a little bit lower risk for them to reach out because they know they're not signing up for like 10 email long chain trying to find a date where you can go for a damn walk.
I love that. Okay, well, you mentioned canceling there. So I have to ask you, I don't know if it's just in my life, in my circle, or if there's a canceling epidemic adjacent to the loneliness epidemic, but I feel like everybody's canceling plans all the time. And I get it. Life is hard and we're over busy, we're over scheduled, all the things. And I can't control anybody else canceling plans they had with me, but you do suggest that I have a stern talking to with myself before I cancel plans with somebody else. Speak more on that, please.
Yeah, like it's similar to what we've been saying. Look, if you're sick or you aren't going to be able to meet your work deadline if you do it, or your kid, whatever, there's sometimes we have to cancel, right? But I think a lot of the canceling, I think there's this thing that's happened, which is like canceling as a form of self-care. So this, you know what I need tonight? I actually just need to watch Netflix and eat ice cream and not talk to anyone. And it's really easy. That's what we did during COVID. And yeah, it felt good to not be in the world for a while, but it's not a great habit. And it's a habit that perpetuates this dynamic that basically everyone says they hate, which is widespread loneliness and isolation. When I feel like canceling, I often tell my husband, and then he'll ask me, okay, why? Is this choice in line with the kind of life community trajectory you're trying to build for yourself? And also, once you get in the car, once you walk there and get there and do it, are you going to feel better once you get past that initial inertia or friction? And if the answer is yes, then you shouldn't cancel. I also think there's a part of this, and I didn't put this in the piece, which is like, for all of this to work, you do need to have a little bit of air in your life, by which I mean, you need to not be so scheduled. You need to, if you're traveling twice a month, every month, or you're constantly coming and going and filling your calendar 3 months in advance, maybe don't do that for a while. See what happens if you look 2 months in the future and there's nothing huge in your diary or calendar from a social perspective. Like, having some energy and some downtime and just days where you can wake up and be responsive to your own energy levels is, I don't know, it's something I do almost all the time now. But for example, when I lived in London, I never did that. Everything was always planned out. There was always a trip on the horizon. And it's harder to live like this if you are that kind of person. And I know people say, yeah, but I have kids and they have to do things and this and that. But like, I really push back against that. Like, you don't have to do what everyone else is doing just because they are. And by the way, like, your kids will benefit from not being so scheduled too. Like, they will survive if they don't have 7 after school activities that keep them scheduled every day of the month. They will probably, I would argue, be better off for it.
Well, before we say goodbye, Rosie, I want to talk to you about a personal problem. And I want your advice. My personal problem is that I tend to obsess over reciprocity, let's say. Like, I'm the person who will reach out, make the plans, have people over to my house, maybe even make you dinner. I'll plant those seeds of connection, right? I'm really good at that. But then I sit around waiting for my phone to ring, waiting for some reciprocity, let's say. Somebody, the person who I planted the seedling with, I expect them to follow up in some way, because frankly, it's tiring to be the person who's always reaching out and getting very little back. It also hurts to think, oh, guess I just don't matter as much. And I know that's a whole nother thing to work through in therapy, but what do you suggest for me and people like me who tend to get cranky and want to give up whenever their efforts are not reciprocated?
Yeah, I feel this way too. I think a lot of, and I've heard from a lot of readers that they do as well. I think to some extent, I say in the piece, you have to stop obsessing over it. One reader said, I'm glad that I'm in a position where I have the home, the budget, and the time to host play dates, even if other people don't reciprocate. And it's nice to pay that privilege for it. And I was like, damn, that person is nicer than I am. But it is actually a nice way to look at it. So I think you have to like be clear about what your boundaries are. Like, there are people that will take, and certainly if you feel like you're really draining your energy trying to help or extend invitations to someone, then maybe stop. But I think like in the context of everything else we've been talking about, it's a way of moving through the world. And I think it's a muscle that you're building, and you're also modeling a kind of behavior that you want to like normalize and make more common amongst other people. I'm finding, and look, I'm very much still, I'm not an expert on this. I'm still doing all of this in real time. I'm finding that the more that I do all these little things, all these mindset shifts, all these habit shifts, the more I'm finding the people that will do that too and will reciprocate. For example, if the person in question is one of those people that's always scheduled and always on a trip and always just so there's no air in their life, then maybe that's not someone they don't want what you're selling, you know, like you're not going to find this there. But I think believing in this as something that's good for you and for the people in your life and something that you want to model for other people, I think you will probably find that things will come back to you.
But they're not going to come back to me if I'm sitting on my couch in my pajamas watching Netflix. I got to put myself up there, I think is the...
Also extend yourself so much that you feel resentful. I think the playdate example is a good one. It is actually sometimes easier to have a kid over, especially if you have an only child, than just entertain your kid yourself. So if that's something that's going to make your day slightly easier and your kid's going to have fun, and they never reciprocate, then who cares? That's something that you were able to find the energy for, and it gave you and your child or your children a little something back. And I think we all have kind of seasons with this in our lives. And part of what motivated me to start writing about this was like coming out of a season where I had absolutely nothing to give anyone else. I really struggled with my mental health when I was pregnant and right after I had my son, and it was just survival. And when I emerged from that, I was like, I really want to regain some of this capacity back and direct it outwards again. And if that's the spirit in which you're doing this, then hopefully maybe it will bother you less if people don't reciprocate.
I like that. And in the meantime, I'll work on being as good of a person as your reader who said she's paying it forward. How lovely. I wish I was that nice of a person, but I'm working on it. What a conversation, Rosie. I'm so happy to have spoken with you. Tell my listeners where they can find you online.
Yes, thank you. I really enjoyed the conversation too. You can find me, my newsletter is hosted on Substack. So you could either Google, what do we do now that we are here, Substack, or the actual URL is Rojo Spinks. So that's my name, ROJOSPINKS.substack.com. And I publish that, or I send that out about twice a month.
It's already linked in the show notes for ease listeners. But again, Rosie, thank you so much. If I come over to your side of the pond, we'll go out for coffee.
Yes, please.
Listeners, that's a wrap. My friends, show notes are at mamaminimalist.com/500. Yes, 500. Now, if you're still listening, I know you liked this episode. If you made it to minute 40, you liked this episode. So please go on with your bad self and support this show. $5 a month, $45 a year. The link to do that is in the show notes. If you listen on Apple Podcasts, you can just hit the subscribe now button with the free trial. If you don't listen on Apple's podcast, you can subscribe via Substack. The link is in the show notes. Thank you for doing your part to keep this show in existence. We will be back on Thursday with another interview. On Thursday, we're discussing why selective mediocrity is the key to happiness. Selective mediocrity. I will see you then for that. Reach out if you need me, and take care.